Hello, this is Tony Blazer, back with another video here for the Motocross Vault reviews on YouTube. For this one, what I'm going to do is have the second installment of our look back at Yamaha's Motocross ads. The first video I did covered the ads of the 70s and their bikes they were promoting. This one will be the 1980s. The 80s started out pretty well for Yamaha, then they had a pretty rough patch there. Starting about 1982 or so, things kind of went downhill for a few years, but they finished up pretty strong. By 1988, the YZ was back on top, the 250 class at least, and it was a very competitive machine. In the 500 division, really the heyday was like 81. After that, it really doesn't get much better. But in any case, they had some great ads during that decade. I had several of these motorcycles. I enjoyed them. You know, they all had their issues, but you know, bikes in the 80s weren't perfect. Even now they aren't perfect, but certainly back then they had a lot more stuff you had to worry about fixing than they do now. So in any case, if you like that sort of thing, make sure you share this on social media. Be very helpful. This new channel, kind of grow it a little bit. And hit the subscribe button, ding the little bell when I upload a new video. And like I said, this is the 1980s in Yamaha's motocross ads. Now, as we get into these ads, the first thing I do want to take note of is just how awesome these classic ads are. As I noted in the first video I did about the 70s, the modern YouTube / internet age has kind of killed print ads. Print media in general is really on the ropes, and certainly these print ads, you don't see anything like this. 8 or 9 page ad for the 1980 YZs in any magazine now. It just would be unheard of. And I gotta be honest, even online, you're not going to see anything as in depth as this. You'll see like little blurbs and stuff, but it's rare to see anything as kind of into the nitty-gritty of the new motorcycles as these ads were. I love this stuff. You know, when I was younger, I ate it up. I read every single word in these things, looked at them a million times, took them out, posted them on my wall. It was just the stuff dreams are made of, and I love this stuff. It's great, and it's cool to look back at it now. Of course, Yamaha coming into 1980 was really on a roll. They were doing real well. They had been on top for years with guys like Brock Glover and Bob Hanna, even other riders like Rick Burgett. Doing really well in the 70s. Yamaha really kicked butt in the 70s. The only real competition, at least here in America, was Suzuki. Suzuki had really good bikes as well. At the production side, actually the Suzukis were probably better than the Yamahas a lot of times, but it was really Yamaha and Suzuki. It was a two-horse race. Honda really was, after coming out real strong, they weren't really doing great in the late 70s. They had come out with the 78 Elsinore, which was a pretty hot machine, but still had pretty weak suspension on it. And the 79 125 wasn't that great, the new 125. Roger DeCoster was retiring that year in 1980, and he would quickly get in the R&D department and get the CRs turned around. But like at this point, again, it's really a two-horse race. Yamaha and Suzuki are the machines to have. Now here for this ad, you see they talk about the all-new machines. Pretty much all the YZs were majorly redesigned that year. New frames, majorly revamped motors, new suspension. There was longer travel shocks. This motor here for 1980 on the YZ250 was smaller overall. They compressed the cases, redesigned the interior, changed the porting, got more power out of a smaller, lighter motor. The original monoshock was still in use in 1980. And it still didn't use a linkage. The rising rate linkages were still a year or so away at this point. Yamaha was kind of stubbornly holding on to that original design they'd used since the early 70s. Now, it did have several innovations and revisions over the years, though. This 1980 version, they did change the chassis around, change the shock as well. The shock was lighter. It's made of aluminum. They added a remote reservoir here to aid cooling. That was a major problem with the early monos. The shock, as you can see here, it's real high on the chassis, and the original ones were, the shock was actually buried inside a tube in the frame, so there wasn't any cooling air getting to it. Didn't have a remote reservoir, so they tended to overheat pretty quickly and had fading issues. So they started adding these remote reservoirs, a trick of the aftermarket, to them, which certainly helped a good deal. And then this one here, they did change it around a little bit to lower the center of gravity. It was still up high, certainly higher than any of the dual shock systems or the later monoshocks like the Honda ProLink. But this was a better design. They also made servicing a lot easier. This year you could get to the preload, and there was a knob here that you can see at the base of the shock that would allow you to adjust the rebound damping as well. I always loved the looks of these original ones. This triangulated swing arm I thought was super trick. Big aluminum unit was very cool. Definitely cool. Maybe not the best suspension by this point. Like I said, the dual shocks actually kind of eclipsed in performance once Suzuki got the dual shock and the laid down shocks figured out. The performance advantage of the monoshock kind of went away, and they had some issues with the original monos. Also had some weird handling traits. They tended to kick and buck if you rolled the throttle off. If you weren't on the throttle real hard, they didn't track very well. They had an issue they called Yamaha, where they would kind of suddenly swap side to side and up. This was kind of one of those weird things with the shock. With the shock was basically bolted directly to the front of the steering stem, so did some weird things in terms of weight transfer when you laid off the throttle. But it was quite an innovation at the time. But by 1980, it was kind of at the end of its life cycle. Now, one thing you'll notice here is what a really huge lineup of machines Yamaha offered in 1980. The all-new 250 YZ, of course, is here, but they also had the YZ 465, which was probably the best Japanese competitor in the open class at the time. The Mako 490, the big European machines, Husqvarnas and stuff, were excellent open class bikes. That's kind of the one division where the Japanese had not just wiped the floor with everybody. But the 465 was a beast in its own right and an excellent machine. There's also the YZ 125, of course. There's a 180, and then the all-new YZ 50 for 1980. This is the first year for the YZ 50, so for those little pocket-sized Bob Hannas to come out and rip. Now, a couple of names in this ad is pretty cool. You'll see, if you're a fan of early 80s motocross or were around at that point, Mouse McCoy, who I think went on to be a stuntman in Hollywood after his pro career didn't really go as planned. But he was a really fast kid back in the late 70s and early 80s. And another name you certainly would recognize would be Eric Kehoe, talking about Eric Kehoe on the YZ80. Now, Eric Kehoe went on to ride for Factory Suzuki for many years, competing in the 125 class and the 250 class and Supercross, and actually went on to be the team manager for Honda years later. Guy's had a really long career as a racer and a guy inside the industry, and still getting it done. On the last couple of pages of the ad here, we have a look at Yamaha's competition center and the fact that their dealers were really involved with making sure your motorcycle was set up properly. Yamaha had a program where they had these wrench reports, they would say, or call them, and they put out if there was a hot setup where you cut 2 millimeters out of your expansion chamber to get you a little more power or something. If they figured out something that Brock Glover was doing on his bike, they put out a little update telling you how to do that for yours. It was always pretty cool back in the 80s. That little thing at the top there is a touch tone phone. If you're not familiar, it looks a little different than your iPhone. Cycle News, of course, down here. Rest in peace. Although I guess they're around digitally, but the lovely magazine version is gone. It's hard to believe now with everything so instantly on the internet, but back then, Cycle News was like the fastest way to find out what happened. You'd find out the results maybe a week or so after what happened. And then in the 90s, they started actually putting out 1-900 numbers you'd call and piss off your parents calling the 1-900 number to find out who won. On the last page here, we have a look at Yamaha's apparel for 1980. Pretty par for the course, probably for the era. Maybe not my favorite gear of all time. Certainly not as good looking as JT's stuff at the time, but if you're running a Yamaha, probably a good bet. For 1981, Yamaha's back with another phenomenal ad and a lineup of highly revised and in some cases all new machines. The big news for 1981 is the 125 here, which gets liquid cooling. As you can see here, this very unique ram scoop front number plate is used because the radiator was originally mounted here behind the handlebars, or in front of the handlebars. It was kind of a strange setup. Yamaha used a similar setup in 1976 on Bob Hanna's Works 125. And early on, the manufacturers weren't real sure what the best thing to do as far as mounting the radiators were. Yamaha here put them up on the handlebars, as did KTM initially. Honda put them a little lower than this. The Hondas did use dual radiators, but they were mounted kind of up at the top of the tank instead of down low. Kawasaki used a single-sided radiator, and really the only manufacturer that kind of got it right, in quotes, was Suzuki, who mounted theirs more or less where we would still see a radiator now, kind of low below the tank, keeping the center of gravity a little bit lower. This mounting here on the top, while I guess it did make it a little easier to, as far as packaging goes down low, you wouldn't have to worry about damaging the radiators in a fall and stuff. There were some advantages in that, but there were issues with, they had to run the plumbing here through the frame, and there were problems with leaks. Eventually the seals would leak. It was overly complicated, and it gave the bike kind of a top-heavy feel. Like I said, you could feel this weight up on the handlebars, and riders who would jump onto one of these off one of the other brands could tell that weight. The motor this year was all new, obviously liquid cooled. There were a lot of changes though. Whirlpool throttles were new this year. Made the throttle a little action a little better. Also didn't have to worry about hooking it on something. The 250 got the Yamaha energy induction system, which in 70s parlance was a boost bottle. What that was like a little still air chamber here that was supposed to, I guess, even out the intake pulses, give you better low end response. So when you whack the throttle open, you got the proper amount of air into the motor. I put one on my 78 CR. Honest to God, I couldn't tell the difference. I had a Yamaha Blaster, had this on it. All the YZ490s in the mid to late 80s had it. I honestly don't know if it ever did anything. Certainly that technology went away, so if it did anything, they figured out a way around it. I don't know, but it was certainly quite a gimmick and a big deal here in 1981. Yamaha was, talking about how cool it was here in this ad. In addition to all the big changes on the 125, there's a lot of small changes across the rest of the lineup. The 250, 125, and 465 all got some chassis revisions that year. Little stuff like the Whirlpool throttle mentioned earlier, and a folding shift lever was new for 1981, which is actually a big deal because in the old days, those non-folding ones, if you dropped your bike on the left, it could actually bend the shift shaft or crack the engine cases or something if you caught the thing wrong. So it was nice to have a $5 part that wasn't going to cause a $100 repair. The monoshock on the YZ80 got a remote reservoir, nice as well. There was an upgrade in brakes on all the big YZs. The 465 and the 250 had what they call dual leading shoes, meaning the shoe was expanded from 2 points instead of one. The 125 still used a single action brake, but there were some upgrades to the cam activating it for 1981. Like I said, pretty much overall, the 81s are very similar to the 82 except for the 125. Minor changes on the big bikes, but the 125 was significantly updated this year. A good year though. The 465 was a great machine. Really, as I said earlier, probably the high water mark for Yamaha, the 80 or 81 465. This next year here we'll introduce the YZ490, and really the open class Yamahas will never be quite as successful as these. These bikes are considered monsters and great machines even today for vintage racing. A lot of people swear by them, they love them. But the 490, kind of overweight, had some issues with pinging and burbling and coughing, and just wasn't ever as well liked as this original YZ465. Certainly an icon, and like I said, a high watermark here in 1981 for Yamaha's open class program. On the last page here, you have a little ad for Cycle News again, talking about how Yamaha was putting their information for their mods and their success in Cycle News, and talking a little bit about Yamaha's dial a wrench program here, where they could get you in touch with a Yamaha engineer if you're having a problem with your YZ. I actually never tried this, so I guess similar to the wrench report stuff, is pretty cool. I'm not sure exactly how in-depth you could get. I don't think you're going to get Keith McCarty on the phone, certainly, but it was cool to have somebody who could help you get your Yamaha sorted out. Back then, obviously, there's a lot to sort out, so it was a good thing to have. Now, before we move on to 1982, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention probably the most significant new model Yamaha introduced in 1981, the all-new PW50 Weisinger. Now, this may not be 100% the most high-performance motocross bike you'll ever see, but if you look through the annals of motocross history, more superstars got their start on this motorcycle than probably any other in the history of motocross. The PW50 here, or as it was called initially, the Weisinger, was a scaled-down little two-stroke, single-speed transmission, nothing super fancy. But once people got their hands on these things, they quickly started modding them, and within a few years, places like Loretta Lynn's and stuff were swamped with kids on these super high, hopped up, fire-breathing Weisingers. So this is the first year for the Weisinger, and it's funny, the PW50, as it's called now, the Pee Wee 50, really isn't much different than this, other than you can see the tank and seat maybe is designed slightly different, but the basic motorcycle is exactly the same. Really, really an iconic motorcycle, and really until the Cobras of the world kind of came out in the 90s and started taking over Pee Wee racing, and KTM, of course, eventually got really big into it as well. This was the motorcycle to have if your little junior wanted to follow you into a racing career. So, an iconic motorcycle, one of the coolest, best-selling, most important motorcycles of all time, and one of Yamaha's all-stars here was introduced in 1981. As we roll into 1982, one of the things you're going to see here is the inexorable march of technology. One of the great things about this era is just how the manufacturers were swinging for the fences every year. There was big changes year over year. Sometimes models literally only last 1 year before they are completely redesigned. And you're seeing that here with the 125 for 1982 was completely redesigned. The 250 was all new. The 490 was an all new machine as well, retiring the beloved 465. The 82s are like completely redesigned from top to bottom, and they have some pretty important innovations. In terms of performance, these bikes were not great. 82 is not a good year for Yamaha. This is really kind of the start of the dark years for Yamaha in a lot of ways. These 82s, like I said, having the radiator here up on the handlebars wasn't a great design. It turned out to be problematic at best. Made the bikes feel kind of top heavy and ponderous. They were so bad, in fact, that Yamaha's factory riders in 1982, they actually decided they wanted to ride air-cooled bikes, which is, if you think about that now, that's like, what? How is that even possible? But yeah, they preferred to ride air-cooled bikes instead of these liquid-cooled versions because even the works versions weren't decent handling. They felt crappy. Bob Hanna just talked about what piles of crap they were. But these bikes were innovative. You're going to see here this tank has a safety seat. Yeah, this is the first year for Yamaha putting that safety up the tank saddle, the work style saddle. Your family jewels appreciate that. Most of the other manufacturers at this point did not have this feature. You would have had to go to Seat Racing or somebody else to get a similar saddle for yours. This is also the first year for a power valve. The Yamaha power valve system was introduced in 1982. It consisted of a rotating drum here that would rotate and uncover a portion of the exhaust port. Based on the engine RPM, use a centrifugal ball governor to spin it up based on what kind of RPM level you were at, and that would give you, in theory at least, a wider power band. Low end power would boost up by having the power valve closed, and then when it would snap open, it would uncover that exhaust port, allow a little better flow, and give you a wider power band. These early versions kind of had mixed results. They weren't the incredible breakthrough that the technology would lead you to believe they were. It took a few years for them to kind of sort out exactly the best way to make use of that power, but this was a big, big innovation. As you can see here, the 250 also got liquid cooling for 1982, so the chassis was all new, liquid cooled motor, power valve. They were, like I said, swinging for the fences here. Really, really trying to make a splash in the 250 class and the 125 class. Didn't really knock it out of the park, but it was, like I said, trying to push the technology forward, which I think everybody who races motocross appreciates. Other than the new power plants, the most significant change for 1982 was probably the all-new rear suspension system. Now, as you see here, this is a very interesting design. It is a one-year design. Yamaha only used it here in 1982. You could see they were just clinging for all their life to that original monoshock. They did not want to give it up for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe somebody was getting some payola back at Yamaha to keep using it and paying Mr. Tilkins for that design. I don't know. But in any case, as I had said earlier, the rising rate rear suspension was really coming on in the early 90s. I'm sorry, the early 80s. Motocross bikes from all the manufacturers had them by 1982. Honda had their ProLink. Kawasaki, who was actually the first one to go single shock with the linkage, was the Unitrack in 1980. Suzuki had their full floater, and Yamaha knew they were getting kind of behind the curve here, so they kind of went with this weird half-assed Monocross, Mono X design, which took the original monoshock and added a linkage to it. This clearly did not get rid of the problems with the monocross, which had to do with its high placement on the chassis. That, along with the radiator, really made the bike kind of top-heavy feeling. Also, again, the shock was kind of buried up in the chassis. So this one-year design used this linkage. Did not work very well. Nobody really cared for it very much. And in 1983, they went with a much more conventional, similar to Honda's ProLink design. This one here, like I said, with the center of gravity up like that, it wasn't really going to work out. You see the shock is massive and heavy, and the 82s in general were really overweight. This big single shock system, the liquid cooling, all that stuff they put on the bike, it was just a heavy, overweight bike. The 250 weighed what a 500 should weigh. Just wasn't a great machine this year, but it is interesting in that this is a 1-year design. Yamaha quickly saw the light though and ditched it. On the last page, Yamaha is once again pimping their Team Yamaha Tech Center and their wrench reports, which were awesome. So feel free again to call up Dave Osterman and Bob Oliver and see what the proper jetting spec is for your new 82 YZ125. As I said earlier, things moved really fast in the early 80s, and Yamaha's back for 1983 with another all-new lineup. All their bikes were completely redesigned and actually much better this year. It's interesting, you can see as I talked about in the last one how the YZs were really overweight in 1982, and it's kind of funny to me that they put a scale as a feature point here in the ad. I guess they were kind of aware of their problem in 1982, and were kind of accentuating how they'd rectify that the next year. If you look here at the 83 models, it really has a, I guess, quote-unquote modern look. As you can see, this is much more what you would have expected out of an 80s motocross machine, kind of the template for most bikes going forward. The new Unitrack design here, you can see, is a bottom link, more similar to what you would have found on the Honda CR at the time. Suzuki was still using their full floater, which was much more complicated design, in the Unitrack as well, which was more of a straight-up shock with a large high-mounted linkage. This is clearly a play on what Honda was doing, which ended up being the design that most everybody ended up going with in the end. In addition to the new Motocross, Mono X rear suspension, the new Yamaha 125 and 250 got new radiators this year. They moved the radiator from the handlebars, yay, down to a much more traditional mounting position below the tank. Again, much more what you would see on any other motocross bike even today. The safety seat was still there. The tank was still kind of wide. These bikes, even though the seat itself was pretty comfortable, it was hard to get forward on them. I had the 85 model, which is very similar to this, and it was still difficult to get kind of forward in the turns. It wasn't flat like a modern bike would be. It was, definitely a steep rise to the tank, and the tank kind of pushed you back. So it was kind of, you really had to fight to get forward. But overall, this is a much more modern design. The suspension this year wasn't great, but it was better than 1982. The new motors were pretty powerful, actually. The 83, 125, and 250 were punchy, powerful motors. Even the 490 was rated pretty well this year. In 1983, all the 500s were still air-cooled, so the 490's air cooling wasn't really a disadvantage. It was just par for the course. The 490 was powerful, but had a kind of a pudgy feel. The bike itself was pretty light. Like I said, they did a lot to lower weight this year, changing to alloys for some stuff. They changed the width of the tubing inside the frame to kind of save a few ounces here and there. So the 490 was actually, all the bikes were pretty light, but the pudgy ergos made them feel heavier than they were, and the 490 ended up losing out to the excellent CR480 this year. But this was a big year for Yamaha. They definitely made some strides in the right direction. Across the board, all the bikes were definitely better than 82, and it felt like things were moving in the right direction. For 1984, Yamaha was back once again with the all-new lineup of motocross bikes. Today, that's just hard to fathom. Some bikes, in the case of Suzuki, might go a decade without getting a major redesign. But back in the early 80s, all these manufacturers were really pouring some serious R&D into these things and revamping them majorly from year to year. So for 84, Yamaha was back. I love the looks of these bikes. This is the last year for the yellow and black here, at least here in America. International bikes were still always white and red, but I love this color scheme. Great looking motocross bikes. The 125, 250 were majorly redesigned. The new chassis, suspension updates, new wheels, all kinds of stuff. Added a little thing called the Z spoke, which would become infamous. The spoke actually went through the center of the hub, and it would it went from one side of the wheel to the other completely. There was no individual spokes like you'd see now. It was one big long spoke that snaked through the center of the wheel hub. Unfortunately, those things would loosen a little bit and crack the hub. So a lot of people had failures where it was kind of reviled. But good looking motorcycles here. In the case of the 250, it was an excellent bike in terms of power. It was a rocket ship. And Yamaha actually was racing production machines this year. Basically the exact same bike that you could buy off the showroom floor with some very minor modifications. Rick Johnson won the 250 outdoor national title with a ported engine, some Simmons anti-cav kit, forks, and an Olin shock. Other than that, the bike itself was very stock. If you ever rode one of these things, they were rocket ships. It was really a fast motorcycle. Ergonomics, again, were not the best. The bike had that big fat tank, kind of hard to get forward on. And if you let off, the stock suspension wasn't great either, but the motor was really fast. In the case of the 125, that couldn't be said. The 125 this year was an absolute turd. It goes down in history as one of the slowest 125s ever built. The thing just couldn't get out of its own way. I don't know what Yamaha did in these couple of years here, but this motor just was a turd. Um, the grips here, it's funny that they mentioned the grips. They're bragging about them here in the lower left, and these things were awful. They were hard as a rock. About the only grips you would probably want to keep on your motorcycle back then were the Honda grips. They were basically the same quality you would have found on a Scott or something really nice at the time. But these Yamaha ones were just hand chewers. They had a thing called Yamaha thumb that would get kind of wear a blister on the inside of your thumb, and they always chewed my palms up. I hated these things. They was kind of one of the first things you'd want to take off your bike. The overall, the 490 this year was not as updated as some of the other bikes, but the chassis was new. They shortened the wheelbase a little bit, did some mods to the motor, put a different carburetor on it. It was still plenty fast. Brock Glover did really well in the Outdoor Nationals, actually beating David Bailey on this thing, again on basically a stock motorcycle, which is just amazing. It still pinged and burbled and kind of coughed and popped, but it was plenty fast. This one does lack the 5-speed transmission, which is kind of a handicap for it. The 4-speed definitely limited its off-road ability and stuff, but for motocross, it wasn't too bad of a handicap. These motorcycles, like I said, were, except for the 125, pretty good bikes. Like I said, if you're stuck on the 125, you're probably hating life, but the others were good motorcycles, other than a few minor little problems. For 1985, the YZ lineup was back with some relatively minor changes after 4 years of pretty large scale changes across the line. For 85, none of the bikes were radically different other than the appearance. On that score, you can see they do look very different. Although I suppose if you weren't in America, they probably didn't change much. But here in the U.S., we had the yellow and black for many years, and this is the first year that American Yamaha went with the, or U.S. Yamaha, I should say, went with the international red and white color scheme. Personally, I like this look a lot. Now, of course, the yellow is very iconic and nostalgic to those of us here who grew up in the U.S., but the red and white always was one of those things that I thought was a cool look, and I actually really love this 85 look. This bike is also the last year that had the big number ones on the number plate. That was something they had started, I think, in 1980, if I remember right. Maybe 79. But in any case, they've been on the bikes for a few years, kind of celebrating the triple championship wins in all three displacement classes in 78, and they had used them on all the bikes there for several years. Now, the 85s themselves weren't radically changed, as I said. The main difference was they added a new rear suspension system here. The shock had a what they called the brake actuated suspension system, or BAS. What that did was had a little line that connected the rear brake lever to the remote reservoir here, and when you applied the brake, it would lower the compression damping. Now, the idea behind this was if you set up the compression damping stiff enough so that it didn't squat under acceleration, it would then kind of bounce and hack and be rough under braking when you wanted it to be a little more supple. So by lowering the compression damping when you applied the rear brake, the theory was that it would make the YZ shock follow the terrain better, give it more compliance, and less of a rough ride under braking. Now, the problem with this was, though, if you accidentally hit the brake lever in the whoops or off a jump, it suddenly reduced compression damping and would cause the shock to kind of blow through the travel too quickly. Because of this, a lot of people ended up just disconnecting this system altogether. It was one of these things that was really innovative in theory, but in practice, most people thought it actually made for a worse performing shock. I had an 85 YZ, and like many, I ended up disconnecting it. Now, the other innovation for 1985 was the addition of a new front disc brake. Now, this obviously pretty important to have on a motocross bike where stopping is as important as going. Yamaha's a little late to the party there. They stuck with the dual leading shoe drum brakes in 1984. Now, their drum brakes were actually very good. Their dual leading shoe was one of the best around, but compared to the discs that were on the competition in terms of Honda and not Suzuki, in terms of Honda and Kawasaki, in 1984, the drums definitely were a disadvantage. So the addition of this disc was a nice thing to have for 1985. Now, other than that, all the bikes got minor changes, new porting across the board. All the machines were basically the same as 1984, except for this very different look. Now, the YZ125 this year continued to be an absolute turd. My best friend had one, and holy crap, it was slow. I mean, you just gave it the gas, and it just went wah wah, and it just didn't go anywhere. It was one of the slowest 125s I ever rode. I don't know if it was quite as bad as the 91, which was another turd. But this 85 was a joke. A lot of people started calling the Yamahas Yama dogs in this era, and it was just a bad couple of years for the YZ125. They got really a reputation for poor performance. If you tried to modify them, they tended to blow up. It wasn't easy to get the YZ to run these years. Now, as I said, when I was talking about the 84 model, the 85 250 was a rocket. I actually had the 85, like I said, and I enjoyed the motor. The motor was just one of the fastest 250s I've ever had. It just came on from the bottom with a massive load of torque and just went. Even Rick Johnson, his 250 factory bike there had very few mods. The bike was so fast it didn't need a lot. The 490 this year continued to be a 4-speed. Some minor porting and carburation changes, but nothing major. All these bikes, like I said, the ergonomics weren't great on them. It was real difficult to get forward in the turns. The tank was real bulbous and had a real steep. You kind of sat in a pocket in a hole there with the tank and the seat the way it was. It was really hard to get forward. The forks also were awful. They were super soft. The cartridge forks were not yet out. This is 85, so they're still a year away from coming to the Honda, and Yamaha would have to wait even a few years after that. But this 85, man, you had to run. You talk about air forks. These were air assisted, meaning they had springs, and you'd actually put a little air in there to assist the springs. And I had to run an exorbitant amount of air in them just to prevent them from bottoming. And that made them harsh, and of course they would pump up. They were just terrible. The hot setup was to change the springs out and get a Simmons kit that would sort out the damping, but in stock condition they were pretty terrible. The shock, like I said, with the bass, even disconnected, wasn't great. It still had that damn Yamaha, so if you hit a square edge bump or something, the sumbitch would send you into a flying W. I almost went end over end on the thing a couple times, hitting a whoop coming out of a turn or something, and it just kicks you in the ass and launches you skyward. The bike was a bit of a handful. Motocross action, I'm sorry, dirt bike, when they tested it, they described the 85 YZ250 as a school bus with 4 flat tires in terms of the way it handled. And it was not a great handling bike, but really the highlight was the motor for sure. Other than that, all the YZs left a little bit to be desired in 85. After a year of fairly minor updates in 85, Yamaha is back to the relentless pace of innovation in 1986 with an all-new set of YZs. The YZ80, 125, 250, and 490 were all new this year with important updates for all of them. The YZ250 and 125 were the most dramatically updated, really with the YZ125 being the main focus. It featured an all-new case reed motor this year. After the 84 and 85 models were such turds, Yamaha went back to the drawing board with a very innovative motor. Very few engines at the time were case reed, and this was one of the first 125s to go this route. There was a new flat slide carburetor. It still maintained the Yamaha power valve system, the same kind of system it had used since 82. On the case of the 250, it got the all-new chassis, new body work. As you can see here, the tank is much narrower. The riding position was way better for 86. The tank droops down on the opposite side of the pipe so that it lowers the center of gravity slightly, and like I said, it was much narrower through the profile. It continued to use the brake actuated suspension system. The Bass was still on these things. Still didn't have a rear disc. That was still a couple of years away on the YZ line. The 490 this year did get the 5-speed transmission everybody been asking for, as well as a new chassis, the redesigned rear shock as well. Good looking motorcycles overall. I like these bikes. The 250 this year was very fast as well, had kind of a really punchy mid-range power band. The suspension, though, was not great. These did not have cartridge forks. Honda did get the cartridge forks this year in '86, and that was one of the kind of the weak points of the YZs this year. The suspension was not great. These damper rod forks were harsh and just didn't take absorb the track as well as what Honda had with their cartridge Shawas. But overall, the YZs were innovative this year, much better in some ways. Still not world beaters across the board, but it was an improvement. For 1987, the YZs were back with a pretty lackluster ad. As I said earlier, I think print ads were much better in the 70s and 80s, but these last few here in the late 80s for Yamaha weren't that great. They certainly didn't have the multi-page ones with all the cool details. Even the 1986 one, which was a two-pager, was pretty cool with the way it exploded the bike and showed everything. These are pretty lame in general, I think. There wasn't a whole lot of changes for 1987. The YZs got a new white shroud. Woohoo! They still had drum brakes in the back. Did not have cartridge forks. They got a new fork called the variable damping fork, which has the unfortunate acronym of VD. And they also had the bass shock still was on there. Really wasn't a much difference. Small porting changes across the board, but no major stuff. And this ad here is just a paragon of hyperbole. It's pretty ridiculous. If you read it, it says, traditionally, YZs have been as near to perfect motocross machines as could ever be hoped for. The right suspension, coupled with the right engines, enveloped in exactly the right frame geometry, made for machines that bordered on unbeatable. That, my friends, is very impressive, although it's complete BS. But that being said, I guess they weren't scared in 1987 to put it out there. The bikes, like I said that year, were okay. The suspension was terrible. The VD forks were really harsh. I mean, they were some of the worst forks I've ever ridden. They were awful. The YZ125 had a very potent but narrow power band. The 250 ran well, strong motor on it, but like I said, the chassis suspension was not great. The bass shock not great. The forks terrible. And the drum brake was, kind of a sore spot if you consider that most of the competition by that point had switched to dual discs. Not great this year. It was kind of overall really just a retread design. The 490 was completely the same except for the crap forks, and it continued to burble and ping and carburate poorly. So overall, not a great year for Yamaha. Pretty boring ad in general. After a mild update year in 1987, the YZs were back for '88 with a pretty major redesign across the board. The 250 was all new, and then every other machine other than the 80 got some significant updates as well. This ad, not the most spectacularly exciting one, but it does highlight the new YZ 250 here, which was, as I said, completely redesigned this year. The motor was the same, but the rest of the chassis was all new. The forks were great this year. They got rid of the VD design and added a true cartridge system, so it was finally on par with Honda. The new layout here was based, at least in appearance, a little bit on the YZM 500 Works version here, which was a incredibly trick 500 with an aluminum chassis, aluminum monocoque airbox. Really a awesome looking machine in 1988. Apparently the bike didn't perform all that great, but it sure was like the trickiest machine on the track that year. The YZ here used a little bit of that YZM styling, gave it a updated look. The ergonomics were better. The tank went up farther. The tank was narrower. I actually had this '88 YZ. The suspension was a little soft, stock, but the motor worked well, handled well. Good motorcycle at the time. And this everything from the chassis to the suspension to the ergonomics were completely redesigned for '88. Now, in addition to the cartridge forks, which were, like I said, a huge improvement, all the '88 YZs finally got a rear disc brake. This brake was really kind of a light switch. I had the '88 250 N125, and the thing was kind of grabby. It was very stall prone. I'd had an '87 CR125, and the disc on that was much easier to modulate. This '88 was, like I said, it was real easy to stall the motor. Now, of course, it probably wouldn't feel particularly powerful, but the thing wasn't the power; it was the feel. Early discs, some of them were kind of grabby, and it was kind of hard to get that feel right. It took them a little while to get it sorted out. But these were great motorcycles. The 490 still had the same engine problems, but the new forks certainly helped the handling of that bike. The 80, like I said, at this point, the 80 was kind of the beginner bike special. If you wanted a bike that was for Junior and he didn't have a lot of experience, the YZ80 was a good choice. The motor was slow, relatively speaking. The chassis was much smaller than the competition. It was by far the smallest 80 in the class. The KX was a much better call if you were like a 16-year-old or something just trying to stick out another year in the 80s. The YZ80 was cramped and small, and if you were going to really do a lot on the professional circuit or go anywhere on it, you're going to need to have some pretty major suspension and engine mods done. But like I said, this was a good year for Yamaha overall and a really good year for the 250. For 89, the YZs were back with my least favorite ad of the 80s. This one here features Mike LaRocco, or at least somebody with Mike LaRocco's number. I assume it probably was Mike, out in front of the pack, leaving some dust behind. This is another sign of just how much things have changed. You wouldn't see a track like this now on the national circuit, but in the 80s, of course, dust bowls were common. Now it'd all be loam and rice holes and mud and everything else. But in any case, the ad itself is like it's pretty lame. There's a tiny little picture of the new YZ125 and 250 in the bottom left. The 490 and the 80 get like a throwaway reference telling you to go look somewhere else to find out about them because they're so disinterested in telling you about the non-existent changes for 89. Now the YZ125 here is all new. It gets the bodywork from the 88 250. It also gets a set of Cartridge KOIB forks up front, a rear disc. Actually, the rear disc, I'm sorry, was the year before. It has a 19-inch wheel, though. They changed the rear wheel to a larger size. That was to give it a little bit better handling. It had a really interesting tire this year. It's kind of a tractor tread design. It was a Bridgestone, really unique, weird tire. I actually had an 89 YZ 125, had this exact motorcycle. It was cool. It was definitely better than my 88. The power was still mostly mid-range only. There wasn't much power above that. It was really strong down low. The 88 and 89, real strong low to mid power, real punchy. Got up and go a lot better than the 87 CR had in terms of low end torque, but did not have the CR's top end. It kind of hit a wall. If you revved it out, it just went slower. And the transmission was super notchy both these years. Now, the ergonomics were way better. For sure, that was definitely an improvement. The 250 was back with fairly minor tweaks to the chassis and motor, but they did get the all-new cartridge fork, upside-down fork up front, which was very trick, and the larger rim in the back. The 490 was back with bold new graphics only. Nothing new other than that. It was obviously at this point, Yamaha was completely disinterested in spending any money on the 490. It was a few $100s cheaper than like a CR500 or a KX500, but it was 5 or 6 horsepower less. The archaic rear drum is still there. The cartridge forks helped a lot. That definitely improved it, but the thing still vibrated and pinged and popped and didn't want to run right half the time. Cool bike if you're looking for like an all-around fun machine. You weren't looking to race motocross, but by this point, the 490 was just completely outdated for motocross. And a lot can be said for the YZ80, same thing. Bold new graphics this year. It does get the new logo. My favorite YZ logo ever, actually. I love this logo, but this bike had really not been updated at all since 1986. They really wouldn't get any more updates until 93 to the total redesign. Again, this is a beginner bike only at this point. If you were serious about motocross, you probably wanted one of the competitors. So there you have it, a look back at the 80s through Yamaha and its ads. This decade certainly was a mixed bag for Yamaha. They had some great machines and also some real turds that came out over time. Not all of them were home runs, but they certainly pushed the envelope in terms of technology. They were innovative. They were the first ones with power valves. They made a lot of strides that towards the inner part of the decade and kind of turned things around quite a bit and ended up having some really great machines in the 90s. So this was, like I said, a real big up and down decade for Yamaha. If you like this sort of thing, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And I also post all kinds of classic videos and pictures on social media. If you want to follow me there, it's at Tony Blazer, TonyBlazier. And you can also follow my writing at pulpmx.com, where I write about classic motocross and classic ads and all this kind of stuff all the time for Steve Mathis. So I hope you enjoyed this, and if so, please share it and tell your friends. And until we meet again, keep the rubber side down and keep the throttle on.